Hey guys, tonight You are lying still as the dark settles, the room quiet enough that every sound feels amplified, the hum of electricity, the far-off traffic, your own breath slowing. In your mind, stone walls rise up around you, warmed by torchlight, and somewhere nearby a door closes with a dull, final sound. You are not in your bed anymore. You are standing in ancient Rome, barefoot on cool tiles, surrounded by a civilization that prides itself on law, order, and tradition, and yet hides something unsettling in the most intimate moment of all. This is not the Rome of marble statues and heroic speeches. This is the Rome of whispered rules, inherited fear, and rituals performed, because no one remembers a time before them. You probably won't survive this night the way you expect to. So, before we go any further, if this quiet space makes you feel even a little less alone, you can like the video and subscribe, but only if it feels right to your heart. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you lying awake in a quiet room at 2 am? Or maybe starting your day in a rainy city, eyes still heavy? Drop your time and place in the comments. Let's remind each other we're not alone out here. Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders relax, and let's begin tonight's slow, strange journey together here on Timeless Sleep. The night you're about to witness is meant to be joyful. That is what everyone insists. A Roman wedding is celebrated as a public triumph, a merging of families, a sign of social stability. There are feasts, music, laughter echoing through narrow streets. But beneath the noise, beneath the carefully choreographed smiles, there is an undercurrent of tension that never quite goes away. Marriage here is not simply about love. It is about control, lineage, property, and obedience. And the wedding night is where all of that becomes real. You walk through the city as the sun dips below the horizon, watching guests drift home while the newly married couple is escorted forward. The bride is young, often shockingly young by modern standards, and wrapped in layers of symbolic clothing. Her hair is arranged in a precise style that marks her transition from girl to wife, and her face is hidden behind a veil the colour of flame. This is not decoration alone, it is a signal. Fire transforms, fire consumes, fire cannot be undone. Marriage in Rome is a legal transfer. This is a matter of record, not speculation. A woman moves from the authority of her father to that of her husband, her legal identity reshaped in a single evening. The household she enters will now define her future, her duties, and her worth. This fact is spoken aloud in law courts and written in dusty texts, but tonight it is enacted in ritual, where symbols carry more weight than words. As you follow them inside, you notice something unsettling. The bride is not entirely in control of her own steps. Tradition demands that she be guided, sometimes even lifted, across the threshold of her new home. The explanation given is superstition. It is said to avoid bad omens, to prevent her from stumbling and inviting misfortune. But standing here, watching the careful choreography, you sense another meaning layered beneath. This is her first act inside the house, and it is not chosen freely. Inside, the air smells of oil lamps and incense. The walls are adorned with images of ancestors, eyes painted wide and solemn, as if they are watching to see whether the old rules will be followed. Household spirits are believed to dwell here, guardians of family continuity, and they are not excluded from this moment. Marriage is not private in the way you understand it. It is witnessed not just by the living, but by the dead, the divine, and the memory of everyone who came before. The bed itself is prepared with care. Objects are placed deliberately, items associated with fertility, stability, and protection. These are not decorative touches. Each carries an expectation. Each implies a future that must unfold in a specific way. You sense the pressure building, invisible but heavy, as though the room itself is leaning in. What Rome does best is normalize this weight. No one calls it cruelty. No one frames it as fear. It is simply how things are done. Girls grow up hearing fragments of what awaits them, not explained fully, but hinted at through gestures and warnings. By the time this night arrives, the unknown is already shaping their thoughts. You feel that tension now, standing at the edge of the room, watching a ritual designed to remove uncertainty by replacing it with inevitability. The groom stands differently. His role is defined by confidence, by expectation rather than transition. Society has prepared him for authority. He has been told, directly and indirectly, that this night confirms his status as head of a household. No veil hides his face, no one lifts him over a threshold. His presence is assumed to belong here. There are witnesses closer than you expect. Older women, relatives, attendants, they linger, offering instructions, murmured reminders of what must be done and why. The idea that intimacy requires solitude has not yet taken root. What matters here is correctness, not comfort. The boundary between guidance and intrusion is thin, and tonight it disappears entirely. You begin to understand why later generations would soften their descriptions of this night. Rome, centuries on, will prefer to remember its weddings as elegant, dignified affairs. The harsher edges will be smoothed into symbolism, the fear rebranded as reverence for tradition. But here, in the moment itself, there is nothing abstract about it. The bride's hands tremble slightly as she is instructed where to stand, where to sit, how to behave. Her body has become the site where law, religion, and family ambition converge. One widely accepted belief holds that the success of a marriage is proven immediately. The first night is not just personal, it is diagnostic. It reveals whether the union is valid, whether the household has been properly formed. Failure is not an option that anyone discusses openly. Silence itself becomes a tool, ensuring compliance through uncertainty. You notice how often language avoids directness. Words circle around the act itself, relying on euphemism and metaphor. This is not modesty alone. It is a way of maintaining distance, of turning something potentially frightening into a prescribed sequence of motions. When instructions are vague, there is less room for resistance. When expectations are implied rather than spoken, questioning them feels almost impossible. The ritual reaches its most intense point, not with noise, but with stillness. The room empties gradually, the lamps are lowered, the door closes. Outside, Rome continues, footsteps, laughter, distant carts rattling over stone, indifferent to the transformation happening behind these walls. Inside, the bride is expected to perform calm acceptance, even if her thoughts are racing. You stand there, feeling the weight of history pressing in. This is not an isolated practice. It is connected to Rome's own origin story, to tales of forced unions framed as necessity, to the belief that stability is born from domination. These stories are taught as foundational myths, and their logic seeps quietly into everyday life. Tonight is where myth becomes practice. What makes this night particularly unsettling is how ordinary it is. No one involved believes they are committing an atrocity. They believe they are preserving order. This is how harmful traditions survive, not through overt cruelty, but through repetition cloaked in normalcy. You can almost hear future scholars debating this moment, arguing over intent, interpretation, and context, while the lived experience remains heavy and unrecorded. As the hours stretch on, the room grows quieter. The rituals have done their work. A new household has been formed, at least on paper. By morning, the bride will emerge changed in the eyes of society, her previous identity officially sealed away. She will be addressed differently, treated differently, expected to think differently. The night has done its job. You step back, letting the scene fade slightly, but not disappear. This is only the beginning. Rome's wedding night ritual does not exist in isolation. It is part of a larger system that will unfold piece by piece as you move forward. The symbols, the silence, the watchers in the dark, they will echo again and again. reshaped but never fully gone. For now, you remain here, suspended in the aftermath, listening to the quiet hum of a civilization convincing itself that this is the natural order of things. You wake into the next stretch of the story already moving, as if the night never truly paused. The walls around you feel closer now, the air heavier with expectation. What happened behind closed doors has consequences that ripple outward, and you follow those ripples back through time, into the bride's life before this night ever arrived. You begin to see how little of this moment actually belongs to her. Long before the veil was lowered over her face, long before the threshold was crossed, the shape of this night was already decided. In Rome, girlhood is brief. Childhood does not stretch lazily into the late teens or early adulthood. It is a narrow bridge between dependency and duty, and families watch closely for the moment when a daughter can be transferred, legally and socially, into another household. You sense how this process begins quietly, almost invisibly. A girl grows up absorbing expectations rather than explanations. She learns where to sit, how to speak, when to lower her eyes. She watches older women move through their days, managing households, bearing children, maintaining appearances. No one needs to say explicitly what her future will be. It is written into every example around her. The law reinforces this from the beginning. A Roman daughter exists under the authority of her father, not merely as a matter of respect, but as a formal legal condition. He controls her property, her marriage prospects, and her public identity. This is not hidden or controversial. It is taught as common sense. When the time comes for marriage, the transfer of authority is seamless, almost bureaucratic. One man's control ends, another's begins, and the woman herself is never the active party in the exchange. You imagine her standing in her childhood home in the days before the wedding, surrounded by familiar objects that are about to lose their meaning. The dolls she once played with are no longer appropriate. Her mother watches closely now, correcting small gestures, reminding her of new expectations. Advice is offered in fragments, careful not to sound like warnings, yet heavy with implication. Endurance is praised. Silence is framed as virtue. Obedience is described as harmony. There is a peculiar contradiction at the heart of this preparation. On the surface, marriage is celebrated as a woman's crowning achievement, the moment she fulfills her purpose. Songs and sayings frame it as an honour, a step upward, and yet the instructions given to her are about reduction, fewer choices, narrower freedoms, smaller spaces. You feel that tension pressing in, the way praise can coexist with loss when a society refuses to acknowledge what is being taken away. The bride's body becomes a focus long before it belongs to her husband. It is monitored, evaluated, discussed indirectly. Fertility is assumed rather than questioned, and any deviation from expectation is treated as a personal failing. She is taught that her worth will soon be measured in outcomes she cannot fully control. This knowledge settles into her quietly, shaping how she carries herself, how she thinks about the night ahead. Fear is not encouraged openly, but it is never truly dispelled either. You walk through the social rituals that surround engagement and betrothal, noticing how much happens without her presence. Agreements are made between families, dowries calculated, alliances strengthened. These negotiations are framed as practical, even loving, but they underscore a central truth. Her marriage is not primarily about her. It is about continuity, about names and inheritance, about ensuring that property and power move along predictable lines. Love may exist, but it is not required. As the wedding approaches, the tone shifts subtly. What was once distant becomes immediate. Clothing is prepared with ritual significance, each piece reinforcing the idea that she is crossing a boundary that cannot be uncrossed. The veil, the hairstyle, the timing of the ceremony, all are designed to mark transformation. You feel how this external choreography mirrors an internal narrowing. The closer the wedding night comes, the fewer paths remain open to her. There is an expectation, deeply ingrained, that resistance is not only futile but inappropriate. A good daughter does not question. A good wife adapts. Stories circulate quietly of women who struggled, who caused disruption, who brought shame. These tales are not always true, but they function effectively as warnings. You sense how conformity is enforced not through violence alone, but through narrative, through the fear of becoming an example whispered about after the fact. You also notice how the language around this transition avoids acknowledging loss. No one says she is leaving one life behind, they say she is beginning another. No one speaks of fear, they speak of modesty. No one names coercion, they name duty. This careful framing allows everyone involved to believe they are participating in something honourable. It dulls the edge of what is happening, making it easier to accept. As you follow her thoughts, you realise how isolated this experience is. While marriage is public, preparation for the wedding night is deeply private in a way that offers no relief. There is no space to articulate doubt without consequence. Questions are answered obliquely or not at all. Curiosity is discouraged. Knowledge arrives only when it can no longer be refused. This imbalance of information is not accidental. It ensures compliance by keeping the unknown intact until the very last moment. The day before the wedding is filled with activity meant to distract. Relatives visit. Rituals are performed. The bride is praised for her composure, her beauty, her good fortune. You can feel how this attention presses down as much as it lifts up. Any visible hesitation would be noticed, interpreted, remembered. She learns quickly that her role now includes emotional performance. What stands out most as you linger here is how normalised all of this feels within the culture. There is no sense of urgency to justify or explain. The system has existed long enough to feel natural. When something is framed as tradition, it becomes difficult to imagine alternatives. You feel that weight, the weight of a society that has rehearsed this moment for generations, refining it until it fits seamlessly into daily life. And yet, cracks exist. Not every woman experiences this transition the same way. Some adapt quickly. Some find ways to carve out influence within their new households. Others carry the memory of this night as a quiet scar, rarely spoken of but never forgotten. These individual experiences rarely make it into official histories. What survives instead is the idealized version, the one that flatters the culture that produced it. As evening falls on the day of the wedding, the bride's former life recedes almost imperceptibly. Her name may change, her loyalties are expected to shift. Even her body language is meant to adjust to signal belonging in a new space. You sense how complete this transformation is intended to be. There is no allowance for liminality. She must be either daughter or wife, never both. Standing at this threshold with her, you understand more clearly why the wedding night carries such symbolic force. It is not merely a beginning, it is a confirmation that everything leading up to it has succeeded. The rituals, the laws, the social pressure, all converge here. By morning, the transition must be complete, visible, undeniable. You feel the story pulling you forward again, back toward the house where the lamps still burn low. The preparation, the conditioning, the quiet narrowing of choice, it all funnels into that single room. What happens there will echo backward, retroactively justifying everything that came before. You take a breath, knowing that what comes next will not soften these impressions, only deepen them. You drift back into the house as though drawn by something older than memory, something that hums quietly beneath the stone floors. The bedchamber does not belong only to the couple within it. In Rome, no room is ever entirely private, and this one least of all. You feel it immediately, the sense that the air is occupied, observed, thick with expectation. This is not metaphorical to the people who live here. They believe, quite plainly, that unseen presences share this space, and tonight those presences matter more than ever. Every Roman household understands itself as a living structure. one sustained not just by walls and roofs, but by forces that must be acknowledged and maintained. Small shrines are built into corners of homes, and offerings are made daily to ensure balance. These practices are not fringe or mystical indulgences, they are as routine as locking a door. The spirits of the household are guardians of continuity, protectors of lineage, and witnesses to moral order. A marriage that begins without their approval is thought to invite disorder, misfortune, even collapse. You watch as the bedroom is prepared earlier in the evening, long before the bride arrives. Nothing is accidental. The placement of the bed, the objects arranged nearby, the direction the couple will face, all of it is chosen with reference to unseen watchers. Certain items are included not for comfort, but for assurance. They signal to the household's guardians that a legitimate union is taking place, that boundaries are being crossed with permission rather than defiance. What strikes you is how matter-of-fact this is. No one whispers nervously or treats these preparations as theatrical. They are calm, practiced, almost bureaucratic. The presence of the unseen is not frightening here, it is authoritative. These forces are not imagined as benevolent in a sentimental sense. They are strict, transactional, concerned with order above all else. Tonight, they must be satisfied. As the couple enters the room, the sense of being watched intensifies. The bride may not fully understand the specifics of these beliefs, but she feels their weight. She has grown up seeing her mother leave offerings, hearing warnings about disrespect, learning that misfortune follows negligence. Now, those lessons converge in this moment. Her body is not just her own, it is a site of ritual significance. What happens here will ripple outward into the household's spiritual health. You notice how language shifts in this space. Instructions become softer, but no less firm. There is a careful avoidance of naming the act itself, as though directness might draw unwanted attention or disrupt the delicate balance being maintained. Euphemism serves as both modesty and protection. To speak plainly would be to risk offending forces that do not tolerate irreverence. One widely held belief insists that the union must be acknowledged not only socially and legally, but cosmically. The household's guardians are thought to confirm whether the marriage is valid, whether the couple is properly aligned. This belief grants the ritual an additional layer of pressure. Failure here is not merely personal or familial, it is existential. Missteps are imagined to invite illness, infertility, or long-term discord. You sense how this belief system functions as reinforcement. When fear or doubt arises, it is not framed as an internal emotional response, but as a potential spiritual flaw. Endurance becomes not just admirable, but necessary. Compliance is recast as harmony with the universe. This reframing is powerful. It removes space for objection by elevating tradition beyond human authorship. The bride's movements are watched closely, even when no one else is physically present. She has been told, indirectly, that disrespect can be detected. Small gestures carry weight. The way she approaches the bed, the way she responds to instruction, all are believed to matter. You feel how exhausting this must be, to navigate not only another person's expectations, but an invisible audience whose standards are absolute. The groom, too, is shaped by these beliefs, though differently. He is not simply exercising personal authority, he is performing a role sanctioned by forces larger than himself. This lends his actions a sense of inevitability. Responsibility and power are intertwined. If something goes wrong, it is not only his household that suffers, but his standing with the unseen guardians. This belief encourages strict adherence to ritual, discouraging deviation even when discomfort is apparent. What emerges here is a picture of intimacy tightly bound to surveillance. The bedroom is a sacred space precisely because it is regulated. Privacy, as you understand it, has little value in this framework. What matters is correctness. The idea that intimacy could exist for its own sake, unobserved and unconstrained, has not yet taken hold. Instead, Intimacy is folded into the same system that governs public life. You think about how this shapes memory. When an experience is framed as ritual, personal feelings become secondary. Discomfort can be dismissed as temporary, fear as irrelevant, because the outcome is believed to serve a greater order. This belief does not erase emotional impact, but it does bury it. Over time, what survives in collective memory is not how the night felt, but how it was supposed to function. As the night deepens, the presence of the unseen is reinforced through small acts. A lamp is left burning longer than necessary. A murmured acknowledgement is offered before sleep. These gestures are subtle, but they signal closure. A kind of cosmic bookkeeping. The household has done what it is required to do. The guardians have been included. Order has been maintained. You begin to see how this belief system protects itself from critique. If something goes wrong later, illness, unhappiness, infertility, the cause can always be located in a failure of ritual rather than in the structure itself. Responsibility is diffused, blame redirected. The system remains intact. What is striking is how little space exists for alternative interpretations. There is no official recognition that these unseen watchers might be constructs, that their authority might be symbolic rather than literal. To question their presence would be to question the foundations of the household, of marriage, of social continuity. Such doubt has consequences. Silence again becomes the safer choice. You stand in the room as the night stretches on, feeling how thick the layers of meaning have become. This is not just a wedding night, it is a negotiation with the cosmos as Rome understands it. The bed is both a physical object and a symbolic altar. The bodies within it are participants in a transaction that extends beyond their own lives. In later centuries, writers will sanitize this aspect of Roman marriage, translating these beliefs into abstract notions of tradition or morality. The idea of unseen witnesses will be softened into metaphor. But here, in this moment, there is nothing abstract about it. The presence is felt, the expectations clear. As the couple eventually rests, the sense of being watched does not entirely fade. It settles, becoming background noise, something to be lived with rather than resolved. This is the condition of life in this household now. The guardians have been acknowledged, the ritual has been completed, the marriage has been cosmically registered. You take a step back, letting the room dim, but carrying the weight of what you have seen. The gods, or what Rome understands as such, have been in the bedroom tonight, silent but decisive, and their presence will continue to shape what this marriage becomes, long after the lamps are extinguished. You move forward without a break, the night unfolding as if it has been waiting for you to notice the details that were always there. Symbols surround you now, closer than before, pressing in from every surface. In Rome, objects are never neutral. They speak, instruct and command. On this night especially, they are tasked with shaping behaviour, directing fear and asserting control, all while presenting themselves as protection. The bride's veil is the first thing you truly see. Its colour is not chosen for beauty alone. It echoes flame, transformation and sacrifice, signalling that the woman beneath it is crossing a boundary that cannot be crossed back. She wears it not only to mark her status, but to obscure herself, to become less visible as an individual and more legible as a role. You sense how the veil functions as both shield and erasure. It protects her from ill fortune according to belief, but it also conceals her reactions, making compliance easier to assume. Fire appears again and again throughout the ceremony and the night that follows. Lamps burn steadily, never fully extinguished, even when sleep approaches. Fire is thought to ward off disorder, to purify transitions, to mark legitimate change. Its presence in the bedchamber is deliberate. It keeps the room from slipping fully into darkness, literal or symbolic. You feel how this constant glow denies the couple the comfort of obscurity. Nothing here is meant to happen unseen. You trace the placement of objects around the bed, noticing how they form a kind of perimeter. Some are associated with fertility, others with stability, others with continuity across generations. Their meanings overlap and reinforce one another, creating a dense network of expectation. These items are not explained to the bride in full. She is expected to know enough to behave correctly, but not enough to question why. Knowledge, again, is carefully rationed. What becomes clear is that these symbols serve multiple audiences. They reassure the household, signal correctness to the unseen guardians, and remind the bride of her obligations all at once. They operate quietly, without coercion that can be named. It is difficult to resist something that presents itself as benign, even beneficial. Protection and domination blur together, indistinguishable in practice. The act of crossing the threshold earlier in the evening lingers in your mind. The bride was lifted, guided, sometimes carried, supposedly to avoid misfortune. Here, the symbolism deepens. She has entered the household without fully entering it on her own terms. This pattern repeats itself throughout the night. Her movements are directed, her responses anticipated, her autonomy absorbed into ritual. You notice how fear is managed rather than eliminated. It is acknowledged indirectly through layers of precaution. Each object promises safety, but only if used correctly. This conditional reassurance keeps anxiety alive, manageable, but never gone. The bride learns quickly that safety depends on obedience, that protection must be earned through correct behaviour. There is also an element of confusion intentionally woven into the ritual. Certain practices are meant to disorient, to blur the boundary between old life and new. This disorientation is framed as symbolic, but it has practical effects. A person who is uncertain is easier to guide. A person who feels unsteady is more likely to rely on instruction. You feel how this moment destabilizes identity just enough to allow a new one to take hold. The groom interacts with these symbols differently. For him, they affirm authority rather than challenge it. He is not obscured or disoriented. He is positioned as interpreter and enforcer of the ritual. His role is active, directive. The objects around the room confirm his status as head of the household, responsible for maintaining order not only socially, but spiritually. As the night progresses, the symbolic language grows quieter but no less powerful. The bride's veil may be lifted, but its absence does not restore balance. By this point, its work has already been done. She has been marked, transitioned, claimed. The removal of the veil signals availability rather than liberation. You sense how symbols can operate efficiently, disappearing once they have reshaped reality. What unsettles you is how natural this all appears to those involved. There is no sense of ceremony tipping into excess, no awareness that the accumulation of symbolism might be overwhelming. It has been refined over generations, stripped of anything that might draw overt attention to its controlling function. What remains is elegant, almost gentle, and therefore difficult to challenge. You reflect on how later retellings will romanticize these details. The veil becomes a sign of modesty. The fire becomes warmth. The objects become quaint relics of an earlier time. But here, in context, their purpose is unmistakable. They choreograph behaviour, reinforce hierarchy, and leave little room for deviation. The bride's internal experience is largely unrecorded, but you can infer it from the structure surrounding her. When every object in a room carries expectation, silence becomes a survival strategy. She learns to read cues quickly, to adjust without being told. This adaptability will serve her later in managing the household, but it begins here, under pressure. You stand back and consider how power operates most effectively when it does not announce itself. These symbols do not threaten, they reassure. They do not demand, they imply. Their authority feels ancient, unquestionable, embedded in the fabric of daily life. To challenge them would be to challenge the world as it is known, As the lamps burn lower, the symbolic perimeter remains intact. Even rest is shaped by ritual. The positioning of bodies, the timing of sleep, the acknowledgement of completion, all are subtly directed. The night is structured from beginning to end, leaving little unmarked space. You feel the story pulling forward again, the symbols receding slightly as their immediate task concludes. But their influence lingers, settling into habit, shaping future nights without the need for ceremony. The bride will carry these meanings with her, internalized, reenacted quietly in her daily life. This is how Rome ensures continuity, not through force alone, but through a careful layering of meaning that turns expectation into instinct. Tonight, the symbols have done their work. You do not leave the room when you think you should. Instead, you become aware of footsteps lingering just beyond the doorway, of shadows that hesitate before withdrawing. In Rome, the boundary between public and private is porous, and on this night it all but dissolves. The idea that a marriage consummates itself in solitude belongs to a later world. Here the wedding night is monitored, framed, and indirectly supervised, not out of voyeurism, but out of obligation. What happens inside this room matters to many people, and they are not prepared to turn away completely. Earlier in the evening, attendants guided the bride with firm gentleness, offering final instructions that felt less like advice and more like reminders of what must occur. Even now, long after the formal rituals are complete, their presence lingers in the air. Older women of the household have fulfilled their duty by preparing the space, steadying the bride, and ensuring that nothing is overlooked. Their authority is informal but unquestioned, rooted in experience rather than law. They have survived this transition themselves, and survival grants them legitimacy. You feel how unsettling this must be, to know that privacy is provisional. The door may be closed, but the expectation of scrutiny remains. The bride has been taught that this attention is protective, that guidance prevents misfortune. Yet the effect is unmistakable. Autonomy shrinks further. Even the most intimate moment of her life is not entirely her own. This lack of privacy is not accidental. It reinforces the idea that marriage is a communal institution rather than a personal bond. The household has a vested interest in the outcome of this night. Elders want reassurance that the rituals were performed correctly, that the union has been properly sealed. Their proximity is a form of quality control, subtle but effective. You notice how the bride's behaviour reflects this awareness. Her movements are careful, her expressions controlled. She has learned that being observed, or potentially observed, requires composure. Emotional authenticity is risky. Silence, again, becomes a shield. This is a skill she will rely on repeatedly as a wife, but it is forged here, under the weight of expectation. The groom, too, is aware of the watchers, though his relationship to them is different. Their presence affirms his new status. He is being recognised as head of a household, entrusted with responsibility. Their lingering is not a threat to him, but a confirmation. Authority grows strongest when it is witnessed. You trace how this dynamic has roots deep in Roman social structure. Reputation matters intensely here, not just for individuals, but for families. A marriage that begins improperly reflects poorly on everyone involved. The wedding night becomes a test, not of affection, but of correctness. Witnesses ensure that the test is passed. This extends beyond physical presence. Even when attendants withdraw, their expectations remain. The bride knows she may be questioned later, indirectly, through comments and assumptions. Certain outcomes are expected. Deviations invite scrutiny. The absence of overt inquiry does not equate to freedom, it merely shifts the pressure inward. You sense how this surveillance is gendered. The bride's conduct is far more likely to be evaluated than the groom's. Her body is where legitimacy is proven, where continuity is confirmed. This asymmetry is rarely acknowledged aloud. It is treated as self-evident, another unspoken rule absorbed through observation rather than instruction. There is also a generational element at work. Older women oversee younger ones, perpetuating the system that shaped them. This is not always done with cruelty. Often it is framed as care, as passing down hard-won knowledge, yet the effect is the same. The cycle continues. Each generation enforces norms that once constrained them, because those norms now define stability. You consider how difficult it would be to resist this structure. Resistance would require not just personal courage, but social isolation. A woman who rejects guidance risks being labelled ungrateful, reckless, or worse. The cost of nonconformity is high, and the rewards uncertain. Most adapt, finding small spaces of agency within the constraints imposed on them. As the night deepens, the watchers finally recede, but their influence does not vanish. The couple remains aware that this moment will be folded into family memory, that it marks the official beginning of a new unit. There is comfort in that continuity for some, but for others, it is suffocating. You feel both possibilities coexisting uneasily. What stands out is how normalised this arrangement is. No one speaks of intrusion. No one frames this as a violation of boundaries. The concept of personal boundaries itself has little relevance here. Identity is relational, defined by one's place within a network of obligations. Privacy is a luxury afforded only where it does not threaten order. You reflect on how this perspective will shift over centuries, how later societies will reinterpret these practices through lenses of romance or propriety. The presence of witnesses will be minimised or erased in retellings, recast as quaint or symbolic. But here, now, it is concrete. The bride feels it in her body, in the way she holds herself, in the careful restraint of her reactions. The night stretches on, and eventually exhaustion dulls the edge of awareness. Even so, the sense of being part of something larger persists. The household has invested in this union, and that investment does not end with the closing of a door. It will surface in advice, in expectations, in judgments passed quietly over time. You take in the scene one last time before it fades, understanding that what you have witnessed is not an aberration, but a feature of a system designed to prioritise continuity over comfort. The watchers have done their work. The marriage has been inaugurated under the gaze of many eyes, seen and unseen. As you move forward again, you carry with you the understanding that this night is never truly private, that its consequences extend far beyond the bedchamber. In Rome, intimacy is always entangled with obligation, and the echoes of this surveillance will shape everything that follows. You feel the weight of expectation settle fully now, pressing inward rather than outward, as though the rituals and watchers have done their work and left something denser behind. What remains is not ceremony, but assumption. In Rome, consent is not a question that waits to be asked. It is presumed, manufactured through ritual, law, and repetition, until it no longer resembles a choice at all. The night moves forward on that presumption, and you move with it, aware that the absence of refusal has been carefully engineered. From the moment the marriage was agreed upon, consent was declared on the bride's behalf. Contracts were drawn, words were spoken in public, gestures were performed at the proper times. Each step reinforced the idea that willingness had already been expressed, that the body would follow where law and tradition had led. By the time the wedding night arrives, the question of desire has been rendered irrelevant. What matters is fulfillment. You sense how powerful this framework is. When consent is embedded in ceremony, it becomes invisible. No one expects a verbal affirmation in the moment itself, because the moment has been pre-authorized. The bride's presence is taken as agreement. Her silence is interpreted as compliance. Her upbringing has prepared her to understand this without explanation. This is not confusion or misunderstanding, it is structure. Roman law is explicit about the authority transferred through marriage, and that authority extends into the private sphere without hesitation. The husband is not required to negotiate, he is expected to enact his role. The system assumes alignment between legal permission and personal readiness, even when that alignment does not exist. You feel how this assumption strips complexity from human experience. Fear, uncertainty, reluctance, these emotions have no official place here. They are treated as obstacles to be managed, not signals to be respected. Ritual steps in to override them, offering certainty where ambiguity might otherwise arise. What makes this particularly effective is how early it begins. Long before the wedding night, the bride has been conditioned to interpret duty as virtue. She has learned that harmony is achieved through accommodation, that conflict is disruptive, shameful. By the time she reaches this night, the internal barriers to refusal are already in place. Even if doubt surfaces, it has nowhere to go. You consider how this differs from coercion, as it is often imagined. There is no single moment of force, no dramatic confrontation. Instead, there is a gradual narrowing of possibility. Each choice removed long before it might be needed. This makes the final act feel inevitable, even natural, despite its emotional weight. The language surrounding this process is telling. Words like obligation, honour, and necessity circulate freely, while words like fear or resistance do not. The absence of certain language shapes reality. If something cannot be named, it cannot be challenged. You feel how silence operates here not as emptiness, but as enforcement. The groom's role within this framework is reinforced by law and custom alike. He has been taught that leadership requires decisiveness, that hesitation undermines authority. The knight affirms this lesson. His actions are framed as rightful, sanctioned by every structure Rome has built. This does not require cruelty, it requires certainty. And certainty, here, is supplied in abundance. You notice how responsibility is diffused. If harm occurs, it can be attributed to tradition, to necessity, to the way things are done. Individuals become functionaries of a larger system. This diffusion protects everyone involved from confronting the moral weight of their actions. The ritual absorbs blame as efficiently as it absorbs doubt. There is also a social urgency embedded in this night. The marriage must be completed promptly to avoid suspicion. Delay invites questions. Questions invite scrutiny. Scrutiny threatens stability. This pressure accelerates compliance, discouraging hesitation. The faster the ritual concludes, the sooner order can be restored. You feel how the bride is expected to internalize this urgency. Her discomfort is framed as temporary, insignificant compared to the importance of the outcome. Endurance becomes a marker of maturity. This framing follows her into married life, shaping how she responds to future expectations. What begins as a single night becomes a template. As the hours pass, the structure holds. The night moves forward as planned, not because every participant feels at ease, but because deviation has been rendered unthinkable. The ritual does not ask whether consent exists, it declares that it must. This declaration is powerful enough to override personal experience, at least publicly. You reflect on how later generations will struggle to interpret this aspect of Roman marriage. The tendency will be to soften, to reinterpret consent as implied affection, to assume that cultural difference explains everything. But standing here, you can see how deliberate the system is. This is not ignorance, it is design. The bride's future will depend on how well she adapts to this design. Some will find ways to assert influence subtly, to negotiate power within the household over time. Others will carry the weight quietly, their inner lives unseen. The system does not account for these differences, it does not need to. Its success is measured collectively, not individually. You feel the night beginning to thin, the intensity giving way to exhaustion. The ritual has reached its end point. Consent has been enacted, whether felt or not. The marriage now exists as a fact, solidified by law, custom, and expectation. The room seems to exhale, as though satisfied. As you step forward again, you carry the understanding that this moment is not isolated. It is one expression of a broader logic, one that prioritizes order over autonomy, continuity over consent. The effects of this logic will appear again and again as you continue, reshaped but recognizable. For now, you remain with the quiet aftermath, aware that what has been decided here will echo long after the night itself fades. The night does not end when the lamps dim. It settles into something quieter, but no less demanding. A space where expectation waits patiently for confirmation. In Rome, a marriage is not considered fully real until it has left a trace. This trace is never discussed openly in polite conversation, yet its importance is understood by everyone involved. The morning must bring proof that the transition has occurred, that the boundary crossed the night before cannot be uncrossed. You feel this pressure even before dawn. The room carries a stillness that is not restful, but anticipatory. What happened here must now be translated into evidence, something that can be recognized by the household and accepted by the wider social order. The night was private only in appearance. Its outcome belongs to others. This expectation has deep roots. Roman society places enormous value on legitimacy, on clear lines of descent. A marriage that cannot be verified invites uncertainty, and uncertainty threatens inheritance, property, and honour. The wedding night becomes a mechanism for eliminating doubt. What matters is not intimacy itself, but confirmation that a new household has been properly formed. You sense how this burden falls disproportionately on the bride. Her body is treated as the site where legitimacy is demonstrated. The focus is not on mutual experience, but on irreversible change. The language surrounding this moment is careful, indirect, but the implication is unmistakable. Something must be shown, even if no one names it aloud. Older women of the household return quietly in the early hours, their movements practiced and efficient. They do not ask questions, they look for signs. Their presence is calm, almost gentle, but the purpose is precise. This inspection is framed as tradition, as reassurance that everything has gone as it should. Yet for the bride, it represents another loss of privacy, another reminder that her experience is subject to evaluation. You feel how invasive this must be, layered on top of exhaustion and emotional overwhelm. The night has demanded endurance. The morning demands confirmation. There is no space between these demands, no pause in which she can simply exist as herself. Even rest is conditional. The groom's role in this process is largely passive. His status is assumed, his authority already secured. The burden of proof does not rest on him. This asymmetry is rarely acknowledged, but it is central to how the ritual functions. Legitimacy is extracted from the bride, not shared. What strikes you is how normalized this scrutiny is. No one involved frames it as cruel. It is spoken of as necessary, even protective. The idea that a woman's body might be her own, not a vessel for social verification, does not enter the conversation. The system does not recognize that possibility. You consider how this expectation shapes memory. For the bride, the wedding night may blur into a single overwhelming experience, its emotional contours flattened by fatigue and fear. But for the household, it crystallizes into a simple binary: success or failure. This simplification erases complexity, leaving behind a narrative that serves social stability. Failure is not openly discussed, but its shadow looms. A night that does not produce the expected signs invites suspicion, gossip, and pressure. Explanations are demanded indirectly, through implication rather than accusation. The bride may be blamed for circumstances beyond her control, her worth questioned in ways that follow her for years. The threat of this outcome reinforces compliance long before the wedding night arrives. you feel how this system polices not only behaviour, but perception. The bride learns to interpret her own experience through the lens of expectation. Discomfort becomes something to endure silently. Confusion becomes a private burden. What matters publicly is the appearance of correctness. This obsession with proof also reveals a deeper anxiety within Roman society. Despite its confidence, its laws, its rituals, there is a persistent fear of ambiguity. The need for visible confirmation suggests an underlying distrust of bodies, of women, of chance itself. The ritual attempts to control what cannot truly be controlled, using symbols and inspections to impose certainty. As daylight begins to filter into the room, the atmosphere shifts. The intensity of the night recedes, replaced by a quieter, more bureaucratic mood. The marriage is now a fact, something that can be referenced, assumed, enforced. The bride's status has changed irreversibly, and everyone behaves accordingly. She is addressed differently. Expectations adjust. The transformation is complete. You notice how quickly the household moves on. There is little acknowledgement of what the night demanded emotionally. Attention turns to practical matters, meals, greetings, the resumption of daily routines. This forward momentum leaves no room for reflection. Whatever the bride feels must be folded into her new role, managed privately. The speed of this transition is striking. One night has reshaped an entire life, and by morning that reshaping is treated as settled. There is no ritual for recovery, no space to process what has occurred. The system values continuity, not care. You think about how history will remember this. Written accounts will focus on law, on ceremony, on the outward markers of marriage. The quiet inspections, the pressure for proof, the emotional toll, these will be mentioned rarely, if at all. They survive mostly in implication, in the gaps between official narratives. Standing here in the morning light, you feel the weight of what has been secured. The marriage now exists as an unquestioned unit, its legitimacy anchored in a moment that cannot be revisited or revised. The bride's experience has been absorbed into that legitimacy, rendered invisible. As you step forward again, leaving the room behind, you understand that this fixation on proof is not confined to this single night. It will echo through the marriage, shaping expectations around fertility, fidelity, and obedience. The demand for evidence does not end here, it simply changes form. For now, the household is satisfied. The night has produced what it needed to produce. Order has been restored, and the bride, now a wife, carries the memory of that night into a future that allows little space for remembering it on her own terms. The morning light does not bring relief so much as a shift in tone. The intensity of the night gives way to something lighter on the surface, but you can feel how little has truly changed. Voices rise again in the house, carrying a familiar rhythm of conversation that suggests normalcy has returned. What is striking is how quickly the mood pivots. The seriousness of ritual dissolves into casual remarks, into songs remembered from other weddings, into comments that hover between celebration and instruction. This is where another layer of control emerges, one that relies not on silence or scrutiny, but on sound. In Rome, weddings are accompanied by verses and chants meant to guide the couple into married life. These are not refined poems meant for quiet contemplation. They are often loud, repetitive, and shared communally. Their tone is playful, even teasing, and that playfulness serves a purpose. It allows sensitive expectations to be voiced without appearing threatening. When something is sung or joked about, it becomes easier to accept, harder to challenge. You hear these songs echoing faintly now, carried through memory rather than space. They speak of endurance, of duty, of what is expected behind closed doors. The words are not always explicit, but their meaning is clear enough to those who know how to listen. The bride has heard versions of them before, sung at other weddings, absorbed without fully understanding. Now, after the night has passed, their implications sharpen. What unsettles you is how effectively this tone masks pressure. Laughter creates a sense of safety, a feeling that nothing truly dangerous is being said. Yet beneath the surface, these songs reinforce norms as firmly as any law. They remind the bride of her role, of what is now expected to continue regularly, predictably. By framing these reminders as light-hearted, the culture avoids confronting their weight. You notice how this laughter is rarely directed at the groom. When teasing occurs, it focuses disproportionately on the bride, on her perceived modesty or transformation. The implication is that she has crossed a boundary and must now adjust to a new set of expectations. The humour carries a warning: deviation will be noticed, discussed, remembered. Because it is delivered with a smile, it feels almost generous. This dynamic is deeply social. These songs and remarks are shared experiences, binding the community together. Everyone present understands their meaning, even if it is never spelled out. Participation signals acceptance of the norms they reinforce. Silence, by contrast, would stand out. To object would be to disrupt not just a joke, but a shared cultural rhythm. You feel how difficult it would be to push back against this. Humour is disarming. It invites agreement, or at least polite acknowledgement. When expectations are framed playfully, resistance feels humourless, overly serious, even rude. The bride learns quickly that the easiest path forward is to smile, to laugh softly, to signal that she understands her place within the shared script. This use of levity is not accidental. It allows the culture to articulate boundaries without appearing harsh. It diffuses tension while maintaining control. By the time the laughter fades, the message has already landed. The bride's behaviour is shaped not through confrontation, but through repetition and social reinforcement. You consider how this atmosphere affects memory. When an experience is surrounded by laughter, it becomes harder to frame it as traumatic, even if it was. The tone influences how events are recalled and discussed later. Discomfort is minimised, reframed as awkwardness or initiation. The seriousness of what has occurred is softened in retrospect, making it easier for the system to persist. As the day unfolds, these lighter interactions continue. Advice is offered in passing, couched in casual remarks. Expectations are restated indirectly. The bride is welcomed, congratulated, reminded of her good fortune. The praise carries conditions, though they are rarely spoken outright. Gratitude is expected. Adjustment is assumed. You notice how this social environment leaves little room for private interpretation. The collective narrative is already being written, and it is a cheerful one. To express unease would be to contradict not just an individual, but an entire group. The bride's internal experience becomes increasingly isolated from the story being told about her. This pattern extends beyond the wedding day. In the weeks and months that follow, similar tones persist. Remarks about marriage, about household management, about intimacy, are often delivered lightly, with an air of familiarity. This consistency reinforces the idea that everything is proceeding as it should. Any difficulties are framed as normal, even humorous, challenges to be managed rather than questioned. You feel how this shapes long-term behaviour. When pressure is delivered through laughter, it becomes internalised differently. The bride may come to police herself, anticipating expectations before they are voiced. Humour becomes a cue rather than a release. What once seemed playful reveals itself as instructive. Standing here, listening to the echoes of these songs and remarks, you understand how power adapts to context. When overt control might provoke resistance, it softens its voice, it learns to smile, it learns to sing, and in doing so, it becomes harder to name, harder to resist. History will often overlook this aspect of Roman marriage. Written records favour law and ritual, the formal structures that can be documented. The everyday sounds, the teasing, the laughter, the songs, fade more easily. yet they are just as influential, shaping behaviour through emotion rather than decree. You let these sounds recede as you move forward again, aware that the likeness you have witnessed is not freedom, but another method of reinforcement. The night's gravity has not disappeared, it has simply been translated into a different register. As the day settles into routine, the bride steps fully into her new role, guided as much by smiles and shared laughter as by rules and rituals. The threat has not vanished, it has learned to hide in plain sight. The story pulls backward now, not away from the wedding night, but deeper into its roots, into a memory Rome tells itself again and again until it hardens into justification. You feel it surface beneath everything you have witnessed, a narrative so familiar that it no longer feels like a warning. It feels like precedent. To understand why this night unfolds as it does, you have to step into Rome's earliest myth, one that lingers like a shadow behind every marriage bed. You are taken to a time when Rome imagines itself as fragile and incomplete, a city of men without families, anxious about survival. The story says that without wives, Rome would fail, but continuity required drastic action. What follows is framed as necessity rather than choice, urgency rather than violence. Women are seized, incorporated into households, and eventually absorbed into the identity of the city itself. Over time, the telling of this story shifts. What begins as abduction is softened into foundation. What begins as force is reframed as destiny. You feel how deeply this narrative informs Roman ideas about marriage. The message is subtle but persistent. Unions begin in imbalance, and order is created afterward. Harmony is not assumed at the start, it is something imposed, then learned. This logic echoes through the wedding night rituals you have already seen. Discomfort is treated as transitional. Resistance is something to be worn down over time. The myth insists that stability justifies coercion. The women in the story are said to eventually accept their roles, to intervene between warring men, to become mothers of Rome. Their initial fear is erased in favour of a redemptive ending. This ending becomes the moral shield that protects everything that follows. If the outcome is civilization, then the method is excused. You notice how often this story is referenced indirectly. It is not always recited in full, but its logic permeates cultural expectations. When a bride is told that adjustment will come, that endurance leads to belonging, this myth hums quietly beneath the words. It reassures those in power that what they demand now will be forgiven later, once harmony is achieved. Standing with this story, you realise how it collapses time. Past violence is used to authorise present control. The suffering of women is treated as an investment that pays dividends in social order. This framing allows Rome to see itself as pragmatic rather than cruel, decisive rather than unjust. You feel how this narrative shapes the bride's role specifically. She is expected to embody the myth's resolution. Her discomfort is not meant to persist, it is meant to transform into loyalty. Her acceptance is assumed to arrive eventually, and that assumption removes urgency to consider her experience now. The system is patient in its own way. It believes time will do the work. What makes this particularly powerful is how the myth centres women as both problem and solution. Rome's survival requires them, yet their autonomy is treated as secondary. They are essential, but not sovereign. This contradiction is never resolved, it is simply normalised. The wedding night becomes one more enactment of this logic, a small-scale repetition of the city's founding drama. You sense how this story is taught, not as a cautionary tale, but as a source of pride. It reinforces the idea that Rome is forged through strength and resolve, that softness is a luxury it cannot afford. Within this worldview, questioning the ethics of the past feels like questioning the legitimacy of the present. As you trace this myth forward through generations, you see how it hardens into expectation. Girls grow up absorbing its lesson without hearing its details. They learn that marriage involves surrender before harmony, fear before belonging. These lessons are not always spoken, but they are embedded in rituals, in jokes, in the assumptions that surround them. You feel how this narrative silences alternative possibilities. It leaves little room to imagine unions built on mutual desire or negotiated consent. Those models exist elsewhere, but Rome's story does not need them. Its identity is already anchored in a myth that privileges order above all else. There is a deep irony here. The myth claims that women eventually embrace their roles, yet the system never truly allows that embrace to be freely given. Acceptance is assumed, not awaited. The outcome is declared in advance, rendering the journey irrelevant. This certainty is comforting to those who benefit from it. You stand with the weight of this realization, seeing how the wedding night you witnessed is not an aberration, but a reenactment. The bride is cast in a role written long before she was born, one that expects her to move from fear to function, from uncertainty to stability, without pausing to ask whether the path itself is just. History will often celebrate this myth as symbolic, stripping it of its violence and focusing on its outcome. But you can feel how alive it remains here, shaping expectations in the most intimate spaces. It is invoked not with words, but with structure. As the story loosens its grip and you are drawn forward again, you carry this understanding with you. The wedding night is not only about two people, it is about a city telling itself that it was right to begin this way, and therefore right to continue. The myth fades into the background, but its logic remains, steady and unquestioned, echoing. You move quietly now, slipping into the spaces where voices lower and instructions are passed in tones meant only for certain ears. If the public rituals and myths establish the framework, it is here, among women, behind closed doors before and after the wedding, that the framework is made livable. You feel the shift immediately. The language changes. The rhythm slows. What is said here is not meant for celebration or record. It is meant for survival. Mothers, aunts, older sisters and neighbours gather around the bride in fragments of time that feel stolen from the larger ceremony. These moments are brief and carefully placed, often while hands are busy with clothing or hair. Advice is woven into mundane tasks, so it does not appear heavy. The tone is gentle, but the content is precise. Endurance is framed as wisdom. Adaptation is framed as strength. What cannot be altered must be managed. You notice how often these women speak from experience rather than ideology. They do not cite law or myth. They speak of nights past, of adjustments made, of lessons learned through repetition rather than choice. Their guidance is practical, not philosophical. They are not defending the system, they are navigating it. In doing so, they become its quiet engineers. There is a tenderness here that does not exist in the public rituals. Hands linger longer, voices soften. Reassurance is offered in small doses, yet even this care carries limits. No one suggests refusal. No one imagines an alternative path. The goal is not escape, but endurance with minimal damage. Comfort is offered, but always within the boundaries of what is considered possible. You feel the complexity of this exchange. These women are not villains. Many of them remember their own wedding nights vividly. The fear, the confusion, the pressure to appear composed. They know what is coming, and they want to help the bride survive it. But survival here means conformity. Their care reinforces the very expectations that once constrained them. Advice often arrives wrapped in metaphor. Instructions are indirect, framed as general truths rather than specific warnings. This ambiguity serves a purpose. It allows the speaker to feel protective without naming the harm directly. It allows the bride to prepare without acknowledging fear openly. Silence and suggestion work together, maintaining a fragile emotional balance. You notice how these whispers often contradict the public narrative. Where songs and jokes frame marriage as joyful initiation, these private conversations acknowledge difficulty. They speak of patience, of learning over time, of the importance of appearing calm even when one does not feel it. This dual messaging creates a split reality the bride must navigate carefully. The advice continues after the wedding night as well. In the days that follow, older women check in subtly, asking questions that sound casual but are loaded with meaning. Responses are evaluated, reassurance offered or withheld accordingly. This ongoing attention reinforces expectations long after the ritual itself has ended. You sense how this network functions as both support system and enforcement mechanism. Women help one another cope, but they also ensure that norms are maintained. Those who struggle too visibly risk becoming cautionary examples. Those who adapt quietly are praised. The system rewards discretion. There is a generational resignation embedded in these exchanges. Many women have come to accept the structure they live within, not because it feels just, but because resistance has proven costly. They pass on strategies rather than challenges. In doing so, they preserve stability for their daughters at the expense of possibility. You reflect on how this private guidance shapes identity. The bride learns not only how to behave, but how to interpret her own feelings. Discomfort becomes something to minimize internally. Fear becomes something to outgrow. The language she is given to describe her experience is limited, steering her toward acceptance rather than critique. What is striking is how effective this quiet instruction is. It does not rely on force or fear alone. It relies on intimacy, on trust between women who share similar constraints. This makes it harder to reject. To refuse the advice would be to reject not just a rule, but the care behind it. You stand in the midst of these conversations, feeling their weight. They are acts of compassion shaped by limitation, kindness constrained by context. They reveal how deeply the system has embedded itself, not just in law and ritual, but in relationships. As time passes, these whispered lessons settle into habit. The bride begins to anticipate expectations without being told. She learns when to speak, when to remain silent, how to navigate moments of discomfort with outward calm. This competence is praised as maturity. History rarely records these exchanges. They leave no monuments, no legal texts, yet they are among the most powerful forces shaping lived experience. They ensure continuity not through decree, but through care carefully aligned with constraint. You feel the story moving forward again, carrying these whispers with it. They will echo in future nights, future conversations, shaping lives quietly and persistently. The wedding night may be over, but its lessons are still being taught, softened by empathy, sustained by necessity. You begin to notice how power settles into place after the night has passed, not dramatically, but with quiet certainty. Nothing official is announced, no ceremony marks the shift. And yet, by morning, something has changed so completely that it feels as though it has always been this way. Authority has moved, and everyone behaves accordingly. In Rome, this transfer is instantaneous, unquestioned, and reinforced through countless small interactions that leave no room for ambiguity. The groom wakes into a role that has been waiting for him. He does not need to claim it aloud, it is assumed. The household responds to him differently now, deferring in subtle ways, seeking his direction where none was required before. This is not arrogance or personal ambition, it is structural. The night has conferred legitimacy, and legitimacy carries weight. You feel how natural this seems within the system. Power is not earned through negotiation or demonstrated care. It is granted through status and ritual. Once granted, it becomes self-reinforcing. The more it is acknowledged, the more solid it feels. The groom's authority is now woven into daily routines, embedded in expectations so ordinary they barely register as control. The bride experiences this shift from the other side. Her status has changed just as completely, but the effect is constricting rather than expansive. She is now expected to orient herself around another person's will, to anticipate needs, to adapt. This adaptation is framed as harmony, as partnership, but the imbalance is clear. Her autonomy has narrowed, even as her responsibilities expand. You notice how quickly this dynamic becomes normalized. There is no adjustment period allowed. The assumption is that the transition is complete. Any lingering hesitation is treated as immaturity rather than a reasonable response to sudden change. The bride learns that competence now means seamless integration into her husband's authority. This authority extends beyond the household into social interactions. When the couple appears in public, their roles are legible to others. People address him first. Decisions are directed toward him. Even when she is present, her voice carries less weight. These cues are subtle but relentless, shaping behaviour through repetition. What is striking is how little justification is required. No one explains why authority should flow this way. It is presented as the natural order, reinforced by law, tradition, and precedent. To question it would be to question Rome itself. The system does not defend its hierarchy, it assumes it. You feel how this certainty simplifies relationships at the cost of equity. There is comfort in clear roles, but that comfort is unevenly distributed. The groom benefits from clarity and affirmation. The bride absorbs the cost of adjustment, learning to navigate expectations without overt acknowledgement of the imbalance. There are limits to this authority, of course. It is not absolute in the sense of unchecked violence. Social norms constrain behaviour to some extent. Excessive cruelty can invite disapproval. But these limits are vague and inconsistently enforced. They do not challenge the fundamental premise that the husband holds power by default. You sense how this arrangement shapes intimacy going forward. The wedding night has established a pattern in which initiative flows in one direction. Desire is secondary to obligation. Over time, this pattern becomes habit. What begins as expectation solidifies into routine, making it harder to imagine alternatives. The bride's strategies for navigating this power structure begin to emerge. She learns when to yield and when to influence quietly. She discovers which moments allow for subtle negotiation and which demand unquestioning compliance. These skills are praised as wisdom, even though they arise from constraint. You reflect on how this affects emotional life. When authority is asymmetrical, vulnerability becomes risky. The bride may learn to guard her inner world, sharing selectively, managing impressions carefully. The groom, meanwhile, may never be required to develop the same sensitivity. The structure does not demand it of him. This imbalance is reinforced through legal mechanisms as well. Property, inheritance, and public standing align with the groom's authority. Even when the bride brings resources into the marriage, control over them often shifts. The wedding night has done more than unite two people. It has reorganized power in tangible ways. You consider how invisible this process is to those who benefit from it. When authority feels natural, it does not register as privilege. The groom may genuinely believe he is simply fulfilling his role, acting responsibly within the expectations placed upon him. The system absolves him of introspection by framing power as duty. Standing here, you feel the quiet finality of this transition. The wedding night was not just an initiation, it was a seal. The authority granted there will shape every decision that follows, from household management to child rearing to public interaction. It does not need to be asserted loudly. It is already assumed. History often portrays Roman marriage as orderly and stable, emphasizing its role in maintaining social cohesion. What those accounts rarely capture is how that cohesion is produced through imbalance, through a redistribution of power that leaves one partner adjusting far more than the other. As you move forward, the echoes of this authority remain with you. They will surface again in conflicts, in expectations around fidelity and obedience, in the way dissent is handled within the household. The wedding night may be past, but the hierarchy it established is only beginning to unfold. You step onward, aware that what you have witnessed is not an exception or an excess, but a foundational mechanism. Rome's strength, as it understands it, is built on clarity of command, and that clarity begins here, in the quiet certainty that settles into place the morning after the wedding night. You feel time begin to pull away from the night itself, not abruptly, but with a slow loosening, as though Rome is already uncomfortable with what lingers too clearly in memory. The rituals you have witnessed do not vanish overnight. They fade unevenly, fraying at the edges, reshaped by changing values and careful forgetting. What once required strict performance begins to be spoken of differently, softened in tone, revised in explanation. Rome does not abandon its customs so much as it rewrites them. As generations pass, the raw mechanics of the wedding night grow less visible. Laws evolve. Social norms shift slightly. The empire expands, absorbs other cultures, encounters ideas that complicate its own traditions. But rather than confronting the discomfort directly, Rome chooses reinterpretation. What was once enforced is reframed as symbolic. What was once feared is recast as meaningful. The structure remains, even as its language changes. You notice how later Roman writers describe marriage with increasing elegance. They emphasize harmony, partnership, mutual respect. They celebrate the household as a site of moral order. The rituals of the wedding night are mentioned briefly, if at all, and when they are, their edges are dulled. Details that once carried pressure are now described as quaint or reverent. The focus shifts from what was demanded to what was supposedly achieved. This process of erasure is subtle and effective. By changing the story, Rome preserves its image without dismantling its foundations. The authority structures remain largely intact, but their origins are obscured. When a practice is described as ancient and honourable, it becomes harder to question. Distance lends legitimacy. You feel how this selective memory serves power. If the discomfort of the past can be reframed as misunderstanding, then the present can continue uninterrupted. The system protects itself not through denial, but through narrative refinement. Harshness becomes tradition. Control becomes order. Endurance becomes virtue. There are moments, though, when the old meanings threaten to resurface. Fragments of earlier practices linger in customs that no longer make full sense. Certain gestures are repeated without clear explanation. Certain expectations persist even when their justification has faded. These remnants act like echoes, faint but persistent, reminding you that something has been lost in translation. You see this most clearly in how marriage is discussed. The language grows increasingly idealized, emphasizing companionship while sidestepping imbalance. The wedding night is spoken of as a natural culmination rather than a test. Consent is assumed without examination. The absence of discussion becomes its own form of silence, one that conceals as much as it reveals. You consider how this rewriting affects those who live within the system. When history presents an idealized version of tradition, individuals who struggle within it may assume the fault lies with them. If marriage is supposed to be harmonious, then discord becomes a personal failure rather than a structural issue. This internalization of blame is one of the most enduring legacies of erasure. Rome's later self-image depends on this process. As the empire positions itself as a civilizing force, it must appear refined, rational, morally superior. Acknowledging coercive foundations would complicate that narrative. So the past is smoothed over, its roughest edges file down until they fit neatly into a story of progress. You feel the tension between memory and forgetting here. Not everything disappears. Women continue to pass down quiet knowledge, adapting to expectations that still feel constraining. Households still operate within hierarchies that echo earlier structures. The system persists even as its justifications shift. What changes most is visibility. Practices once openly enforced become private assumptions. Authority is exercised less overtly, but no less effectively. The wedding night no longer requires the same explicit oversight, yet its expectations are embedded deeply enough that they rarely need reinforcement. This is how power matures, by becoming invisible. You reflect on how this affects historical record. What survives are texts written by those with the least incentive to document discomfort. The voices of those most affected are filtered, summarized, or omitted. Their experiences become footnotes, if they appear at all. History remembers the structure, not the cost. Standing here, you feel the weight of this transformation. Erasure does not mean resolution. It means that unresolved harm is carried forward without acknowledgement. The rituals may change, but the logic behind them remains remarkably consistent. Order is still prioritized over autonomy. Stability still outweighs consent. You see how this pattern extends beyond Rome. Cultures everywhere refine their stories over time, presenting traditions as gentler than they were. This is not unique to one place or era. It is a human tendency, one that allows societies to continue without confronting their origins too closely. As the narrative moves forward, the wedding night becomes less visible in its original form, but its influence remains embedded in expectations around marriage, authority, and gender. The absence of explicit ritual does not equate to freedom. It often signals that control has become habitual. You let this understanding settle. What Rome tried to erase was not the ritual itself, but the discomfort it revealed. By rewriting the story, it preserved the system while absolving itself of responsibility for its effects. This erasure is not total, but it is effective enough to shape memory for centuries. The night you witnessed still echoes, even as its details blur. It survives in assumptions, in roles taken for granted, in hierarchies that feel natural because they are old. And as you move onward, you carry the awareness that forgetting is not neutral. It is an act with consequences. You are carried outward now, away from Rome's narrow streets and familiar stone, not to escape what you have seen, but to test it against other nights, other thresholds, other rooms where history has arranged itself in similar ways. The world widens, and with it comes a quiet realization: Rome is not alone. The wedding night you have been walking through is part of a broader human pattern, one that repeats itself across cultures, reshaped by climate, belief, and power, yet recognizably familiar each time. You step into other societies where marriage is also less about intimacy and more about transition, proof, and control. The details differ, but the structure remains. A young person is moved from one authority to another. Ritual steps in where consent might otherwise complicate the process. The private body becomes a public concern. You feel how these nights echo one another, separated by distance but connected by logic. In some places, the wedding night is overseen not by elders at the door, but by the expectation of communal verification the next morning. The signs differ, the language shifts, but the pressure is unmistakable. The union must be confirmed. Doubt must be eliminated. What happens in the darkness belongs to the daylight. You recognize this impulse instantly. It is the same one you felt in Rome, a fear of ambiguity, a need to anchor social order in the most intimate act available. You move through regions where ritual objects replace witnesses, where charms, symbols, or specific actions are believed to ensure success. The couple may be alone, but they are never unobserved in spirit. Invisible eyes follow them into the night, just as they did in Rome. The belief systems differ, but the effect is similar. Privacy is conditional. Intimacy is regulated. In other cultures, the wedding night is preceded by instruction that mirrors what you heard whispered by Roman women. Elders offer advice framed as care, emphasizing endurance, patience, and adaptation. The tone is protective, yet it funnels the newly married toward compliance. The language is different, but the message is the same. This is difficult, but it is necessary. You will adjust. Everyone does. You notice how often humour appears in these parallel nights as well, though it takes different forms. Songs, teasing remarks, playful threats, all serve to communicate expectations without direct confrontation. The strategy is remarkably consistent. When pressure is wrapped in levity, it feels lighter, even when its consequences are heavy. Laughter becomes a tool that smooths the path into obligation. As you move from place to place, you begin to see how gender shapes these experiences almost everywhere. The burden of proof, the weight of adaptation, the scrutiny of behaviour fall more heavily on one partner than the other. Authority settles predictably. This pattern is so widespread that it begins to feel structural rather than cultural. Different societies arrive at similar arrangements through different routes, but they converge on familiar outcomes. You pause in societies where the wedding night is framed as a test, one that determines future status. Success brings acceptance, failure brings stigma. This logic is not always written into law, but it is enforced socially, through gossip, reputation, and exclusion. The pressure to perform correctly becomes internalized long before the night arrives. Fear is managed through ritual, expectation, and silence. In some regions, you find practices that attempt to soften this transition, allowing space for gradual adjustment. Yet even here, the underlying assumption remains: marriage marks a loss of one identity and the adoption of another. The individual is expected to conform to a role defined externally. Choice exists, but within narrow boundaries. What strikes you most is how rarely these systems are questioned at their core. Discomfort is acknowledged, even anticipated, but it is rarely allowed to challenge the structure itself. Instead, individuals are encouraged to adapt, to endure, to find meaning within constraint. This mirrors what you saw in Rome, where rewriting and reinterpretation replaced reckoning. You feel a growing sense of continuity across time and space. The wedding night becomes a focal point because it is where societies negotiate control most efficiently. It is a moment of vulnerability, of transition, of emotional intensity. By structuring that moment carefully, cultures reinforce their values at the deepest level. As you move further, you also encounter variations that hint at alternatives. Some societies emphasize mutual initiation, shared responsibility, or delayed consummation to allow familiarity to grow. These differences stand out not because they are perfect, but because they reveal that the patterns you have seen are not inevitable. They are chosen, reinforced, and preserved. You realize how important this distinction is. When a practice feels universal, it becomes easier to accept as natural. Seeing variation disrupts that illusion. It suggests that Rome's rituals, and those like them, were not the only way to structure marriage, even in their own time. They were simply the way that aligned most closely with existing power structures. History tends to flatten these differences, highlighting dominant narratives while minimizing alternatives. The practices that reinforce authority are recorded, celebrated, and transmitted. Those that challenge it are often marginalized or forgotten. This selective memory shapes how the past is understood and how the present justifies itself. Standing at this crossroads of cultures, you feel the weight of repetition. The wedding night is not just a personal milestone, it is a cultural mechanism. Wherever societies fear disorder, they turn to ritual. Wherever power seeks stability, it anchors itself in intimacy. As the world narrows again and Rome comes back into view, you carry these parallels with you. They do not dilute what you witnessed there, they sharpen it. Rome's practices are neither uniquely cruel nor uniquely benign. They are part of a broader human effort to manage uncertainty through control. You step forward, aware that comparison has not softened the story, only expanded it. The night you began in Rome belongs to a much larger map, one where countless individuals have stood at similar thresholds, guided, constrained, and reshaped by expectations older than themselves. You return from that wider map of cultures carrying a strange familiarity, as though the distance has clarified rather than diluted what you saw in Rome. Now, as the city comes back into focus, you begin to notice how much of that ancient night still lingers, faint but persistent, woven into practices that claim to be modern, gentle, harmless. The rituals have thinned, the language softened, but the underlying shapes remain recognizable if you know how to look. You move forward in time, watching Roman customs dissolve into medieval ones, then into practices that dress themselves in romance rather than authority. The wedding night loses its overt supervision. Elders no longer wait outside doors. Proof is no longer formally inspected. And yet, expectations survive, embedded in assumptions about what must happen, when it must happen, and what it means if it does not. The structure has learnt to hide. You notice how symbolism replaces enforcement. Objects once heavy with command become decorative traditions. The veil remains, now framed as beauty and modesty rather than transition and concealment. The threshold is still crossed with ceremony, though few remember why it was once feared. Firelight becomes candlelight, warmth instead of vigilance. Each element survives, stripped of its original explanation but not entirely of its function. You feel how this transformation allows continuity without accountability. When rituals are reframed as romantic, their power becomes harder to interrogate. Who would question something so lovely, so familiar, so widely celebrated? The past is not denied, it is aestheticized. Its sharp edges are polished until they reflect something comforting. Expectations surrounding the wedding night persist as well, though they are rarely stated outright. There is still an assumption that something definitive occurs, that a line is crossed, that the relationship changes irreversibly in a single evening. When that assumption is challenged, discomfort surfaces quickly. Questions arise. Doubts creep in. The language may be gentler now, but the pressure remains. You notice how silence still plays a role. Even in societies that speak openly about relationships, the wedding night often occupies a strange liminal space. It is talked around rather than about. Advice is still offered obliquely. Discomfort is minimized. The idea that this night might be complicated, uneven, or emotionally fraught is often acknowledged only in private, if at all. You trace how gender continues to shape these expectations. Though legal structures have shifted, cultural ones lag behind. Responsibility for adaptation still falls unevenly. Emotional labour is still expected more from one partner than the other. Authority may be negotiated now, but the default assumptions are slow to change. You feel how the legacy of erasure plays into this. When history presents marriage as a timeless romance, present-day struggles feel like deviations rather than echoes. Individuals may blame themselves for feeling out of step with expectations, unaware that those expectations are inherited from systems that never prioritized mutual ease. The remnants of ritual appear in language as well. Phrases about giving oneself, about belonging, about becoming complete surface repeatedly, often without scrutiny. These phrases carry assumptions about ownership and transformation that trace back to earlier structures. They are spoken casually, lovingly even, yet they reinforce ideas older than the words themselves. You watch how popular stories and ceremonies reinforce these ideas. The wedding is framed as an ending rather than a beginning, the final chapter of one life and the start of another. This framing echoes the ancient emphasis on irreversible transition. The individual disappears into the unit. Identity shifts overnight. The logic is familiar. What changes most is visibility. Modern societies often pride themselves on choice and autonomy, and in many ways those gains are real. But the persistence of these symbolic expectations reveals how deeply embedded they are. Choice exists, yet it is shaped by narratives that predefine what that choice should look like. You feel a quiet tension here, between progress and inheritance. Many people navigate this space thoughtfully, renegotiating roles, questioning assumptions, creating relationships that resist older patterns. But the effort required to do so is telling. It reveals how much of the past still presses inward, asking to be reenacted. You consider how rarely these continuities are acknowledged. To admit that modern rituals carry ancient power structures is uncomfortable. It complicates celebration. It asks for a reflection where ease is preferred, and so the conversation is often deferred, left to scholars, or ignored entirely. Standing in this present moment, you feel the weight of what has travelled forward. Rome tried to erase the harsher truths of its wedding night by rewriting them as tradition. That rewriting succeeded well enough that echoes persist even where Rome itself has long fallen. The system outlived the city. You also notice how awareness begins to shift things. When people learn where customs come from, when they question why certain expectations feel so heavy, space opens up. The ritual loses some of its inevitability. The night becomes negotiable rather than predetermined. This awareness does not erase the past, but it changes how the present engages with it. You feel the story slowing slightly now, as though preparing to release its grip. The parallels, the survivals, the quiet persistence of old structures, they have all led here, to a recognition rather than a revelation. Nothing you have seen is entirely gone. Nothing is entirely fixed either. As you move forward, the wedding night becomes less a single moment and more a lens, a way of seeing how societies manage vulnerability and change. Rome's version was stark, explicit, unapologetic. Later versions are subtler, but the logic remains legible. You carry this understanding with you as the night deepens again, the story preparing to soften. What survives from Rome is not just a ritual, but a habit of mind, the belief that order requires surrender, that intimacy must serve structure. Seeing that belief is the first step toward loosening it. And so you step onward, not away from the past, but with it, aware now of how quietly it still speaks. The pace begins to ease now, almost imperceptibly at first, as though the story itself senses that it has carried you far enough into tension, and is ready to loosen its grip. You are no longer standing in a single room, or even a single century. Instead, you drift in a quieter space between then and now, where the weight of everything you've witnessed settles into something reflective rather than urgent. The wedding night, once sharp and crowded with expectation, starts to recede, leaving behind its outlines rather than its noise. You notice how distance changes the way events feel. What once seemed overwhelming becomes easier to hold when viewed from afar. Not because it was less serious, but because time has given you room to breathe around it. The rituals, the pressure, the silence, the watchful eyes, they begin to arrange themselves into patterns rather than moments. You can see how they connect, how they repeat, how they adapt, and how they slowly lose their sharpest edges as societies shift, even if they never disappear entirely. There is a strange calm in recognizing this. Understanding does not excuse what you've seen, but it gives it context. Rome's wedding night was not an isolated cruelty, nor was it a unique aberration. It was a concentrated expression of how power, fear, and continuity often intersect when societies try to control what feels most unpredictable. Intimacy has always frightened systems built on order, because intimacy is personal, variable, resistant to standardization. Ritual was Rome's answer to that fear. You feel your body respond to this realization with a kind of release. The tension you carried earlier, the tightness in the chest that came with each new layer of control, softens. Not because the story has become gentler, but because you are no longer trapped inside it. You are observing rather than enduring. This distance allows compassion to surface, not just for the brides whose lives were reshaped in a single night, but for the generations who inherited these systems without ever choosing them. You think about how many people lived their entire lives within structures they never designed, doing their best to survive them with grace, cleverness, or quiet resilience. The women who whispered advice, the men who stepped into authority without questioning its source, the families who believed stability mattered more than comfort, all of them were shaped by something larger than themselves. This does not flatten responsibility, but it does complicate judgment. As the story slows, you begin to notice quieter details that were easy to miss before. the way routines return after upheaval, the way daily life absorbs even the most intense moments and carries on. The bride becomes a wife not through a single act, but through repetition, preparing meals, managing space, learning when to speak and when not to. The night that once loomed so large becomes one memory among many, though its influence never fully fades. You realise that this is often how history works. Dramatic moments feel decisive in retrospect, but lived experience is shaped just as much by what follows. The wedding night mattered because it set expectations, but it was the days and years afterward that turned those expectations into habit. Control rarely relies on constant force. It relies on normalization. This realization brings a gentler tone to your thoughts. You are no longer bracing for impact. Instead, you are tracing ripples. You see how rituals lose their power not when they are banned or erased, but when they are questioned, reshaped, or quietly ignored. You see how individuals, even within rigid systems, find ways to soften what they inherit. Small acts of care, mutual understanding, and renegotiation accumulate over time, slowly altering what once felt immovable. You feel the story's energy shift inward. Where earlier sections pressed outward, examining structures and systems, this moment invites reflection. How many expectations in your own world arrive without explanation? How many rituals feel inevitable simply because they are familiar? The questions surface gently, without accusation. This is not a demand to judge the past or condemn the present, but an invitation to notice. The image of Rome at night returns briefly, but it looks different now. The lamps are dimmer, the streets quieter. The urgency has drained away, leaving behind stone that has seen centuries of lives begin and end. The city feels less like a stage for ritual, and more like a container for countless human stories, most of them never recorded, most of them ordinary in ways history rarely preserves. You sense the story preparing to let you rest. The weight you've carried begins to settle into something steadier, less sharp. Understanding replaces shock. Recognition replaces fear. The wedding night no longer looms as a single horrifying secret, but as part of a long human struggle to balance order and care, structure and empathy. Your breathing slows as the narrative itself slows. Sentences stretch out. Images soften at the edges. You are no longer being pulled forward. You are being gently guided towards stillness. The past is still present, but it no longer demands your vigilance. You carry one last awareness with you as this section draws to a close. History does not vanish when we stop looking at it, but it also does not control us completely. The rituals that once shaped, live so rigidly now, survive mostly as echoes, reminders of how things were done, not instructions for how they must be done forever. That thought settles warmly, like a blanket drawn up around the shoulders. You are still awake, still aware, but no longer tense. The story has given you what it needed to give. What remains is space to rest, to reflect, to let the images fade naturally rather than abruptly. The night grows quieter again, and you drift with it, knowing the final stretch will not ask anything of you except presence. You are moving more slowly now, as though the story itself has begun to exhale. The images that once arrived sharply now drift in and out, softer around the edges, like memories recalled just before sleep. Rome no longer presses in on you with urgency. Instead, it feels distant, a landscape you've walked through and can now leave behind without fear of being pulled back. What remains is not the noise of ritual, but the quiet understanding of how deeply it shaped the lives within it. You think again of the wedding night, not as a single moment of horror, but as a convergence point, a place where law, belief, fear, and hope collided in one small room. It was never only about intimacy. It was about certainty in an uncertain world, about securing the future by controlling the present. That does not make it gentle, but it makes it human. Systems are built by people who are afraid of chaos, and those systems often ask the most from those with the least power to refuse. The faces you encountered along the way begin to blur together. Brides, mothers, elders, husbands, households. They dissolve into a broader sense of humanity trying to hold itself together. Some enforced the rules, some endured them, some softened their edges where they could. Most did not have the language to name what felt wrong, only the instinct to survive and adapt. This does not absolve the harm, but it situates it within a long, complicated inheritance. You feel compassion settle in quietly, without effort. Compassion not as forgiveness, but as understanding. Understanding how traditions can outlive their usefulness, how rituals can persist long after their original purpose has faded, how people can participate in systems that hurt them, because those systems also provide belonging, identity, and stability. As the story winds down, the sharpest details begin to loosen their grip. The lamps dim, the walls recede. The tension that once filled the air dissolves into something gentler, like the echo of footsteps long after they've passed. You are no longer standing inside the past. You are standing beside it, able to look without being consumed. You notice your own body now, the weight of it resting wherever you are, the rhythm of your breathing, the way your shoulders have slowly dropped as the story softened. This awareness feels grounding. You are here, now, safe in the present, carrying knowledge rather than fear. The past does not vanish, but it no longer demands your vigilance. It becomes something you can hold loosely, examine when needed, and set down again. Rome's wedding night, once hidden and later rewritten, no longer has power over you. It is a story, heavy, complex, instructive, but it is not yours to live. The pacing slows further. Sentences stretch and relax. The night outside your space feels quieter too, as if it has been listening. Whatever time it is for you, late night, early morning, somewhere in between, there is a sense of shared stillness. Other people, in other places, are winding down at the same moment, their thoughts drifting just as yours are now. You let the final images fade naturally. Stone gives way to darkness. Firelight dims into a warm glow, then into nothing at all. The rituals dissolve, leaving behind only silence and breath. And in that quiet, there is reassurance. You have walked through a difficult history without being swallowed by it. You have seen how control was disguised as tradition, how fear was softened into ritual, and how time slowly loosened what once felt immovable. That understanding does not weigh you down. It steadies you. Now, the night no longer asks you to observe or analyze. It invites you to rest. Your thoughts slow. Your breathing deepens. The edges of awareness blur gently, without urgency, without demand. There is nothing left to uncover, nothing left to confront. Just the quiet. Just the soft sense of being held by the moment. And as the story finally releases you, it does so gently, leaving you in a calm, dim space where sleep can arrive whenever it's ready.